I am staying. Book was nevertheless beginning to have his doubts, for his men had accomplished about all they could. For the better part of a day they had occupied what appeared to be a German battalion, and had frustrated any advance in the direction of Hunfeld into the division's exposed flank. Given the growing shortage of ammunition, he could hold little longer in any case. He called for 2 men to go to the regimental headquarters and return either with ammunition and reinforcements or with authority to withdraw, but neither man made it. Down the hill in Lanzerath, a German sergeant, Vince Kuhlbach, protested against continuing to attack the Americans across the open field, and in gathering dusk, 50 Germans assembled behind the Schur house and began advancing against the flank of the position. As the darkness thickened, the paratroopers were soon in among the foxholes, pulling the occupants out at gunpoint, clearing one foxhole after another. A burst from a burp gun into the foxhole that Buch shared with Sakanicus caught Sakanicus in the right side of his face, blowing out his right eyeball and leaving it hanging limply in the cavern where his cheek had been. Buch himself was hit in the leg. Downhill, Adolf Schur was struck by the sudden silence. Soon he saw Americans coming down past his house, their helmets gone, their hands above their heads. Then came the wounded, not many, only 5 or 6. A German soldier and an American lieutenant were supporting one man whose face looked as if it had been blown away. Adolf watched in morbid fascination and followed the procession until the wounded and their guards went into the Café Scholzen. Inside the little tavern, Buch and Sakanicus lay on the floor beneath a cuckoo clock hanging on the wall. They had been there for what seemed to Buch a long time when the clock signaled midnight. It was December 17th. He was 21 years old, thought Buch. He had become a man. Because American commanders had anticipated that the Germans would make some kind of riposte in response to the attack on the Roer River dams, their first reaction early on the morning of December 16th was that was what was happening. At 8:30 a.m., the former commander of the 1st Infantry Division, Major and General C. Ralph Hubner, who was acting as deputy commander of the Vieh Corps in anticipation of assuming command when General Giraud moved up to take command of a new army headquarters, visited General Lauer at headquarters of the 99th Division in the town of Butgenbach, and the two agreed that that was the case. From a forward headquarters in the village of Würzfeld behind the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath, the commander of the 2D Division, General Robertson, was at first unaware that anything untoward was happening other than the unusually heavy German artillery fire just before dawn, yet that, too, could have been a predictable reaction to the attack by Robertson's troops at Wallerscheid. The first indication Robertson had that the 99th Division might be in trouble came later in the morning in a roundabout way via a telephone call to Robertson's artillery commander, Brig. General John H. Hines. The caller identified himself as a captain on the 99th Division staff and asked for loan of the battalion of towed tank destroyers that was attached to the 2D Division. Hines thought it so strange that a junior officer should make the request, and to him, the artillery commander, rather than to Robertson, that he reported the call immediately to Robertson. Concerned as he had been since the start of his division's attack, lest the Germans cut the lone road leading to his attacking regiments, Robertson hurried with Hines to the 99th Division's headquarters in an imposing villa in Butgenbach. What they found appalled them. The living room of the house was in tumult, crowded with enlisted men and officers, everybody seemingly trying to talk at once, and at one side of the room the division commander himself, General Lauer, playing a piano as was his wont in times of crisis. "Cannot we go to your CP where we can talk?" Robertson asked above the din. "This is my CP," replied Lauer. As Robertson discerned the situation from Lauer, the Germans had attacked the 99th Division at several points, but Lauer insisted he had matters in hand. On the basis of the confusion at the command post, Robertson was inclined to think otherwise. Robertson and General Hines headed back for Würzfeld more concerned than ever about the 2D Division's lone supply route, and the thought struck Robertson that he had better begin considering withdrawal from the attack at Wallerscheid. Yet his mission still was to exploit the capture of the pillboxes, and barring a change in orders that had to have priority. To increase his forces for the exploitation, he directed the commander of his reserve regiment, the 23D Infantry, to begin moving his regiment forward. A battalion was soon on the way to a bivouac alongside the forest road a mile or so beyond the twin villages. Before noon, Robertson learned that he was to lose the combat command of the 9th Armored Division that had been attached to his division to help in the drive for the Roer River dams. That, Robertson assumed, was a result of the German attack against the 106th Division in the 2D Division's old defensive positions near St.Vith, word of which reached Robertson through the Corps commander, General Gero, like Robertson, was worried. Early in the afternoon, he asked the commander of the First Army, General Hodges, for authority to call off the 2D Division's attack and move the division back to the positions he had charted earlier on the Elsenborn Ridge. Obviously less concerned than Gero about what might be developing, Hodges refused. In mid-afternoon, Gero telephoned Robertson, ordering him apparently at General Lauer's request to release the 2 remaining battalions of his reserve, the 23D Infantry, for attachment to the 99th Division. 1 battalion was to go to the village of Hunningen, a short distance behind the Losheim Gap crossroads, and the positions of the 394th Infantry, there to occupy defensive positions that Lauer, in concern for the fragile nature of his division's south flank, had ordered dug long before. The other battalion was to move into the forest east of Krinkelt-Rocherath, and at dawn on the 17th attack to restore the positions of Colonel Allen's 3D Battalion, 393D Infantry. That General Lauer would ask the help of those 2 battalions told Robertson something of how serious Lauer's situation had become. He had almost decided to take it on himself to halt his division's attack and withdraw when he had a visit from Gero's deputy, Ralph Hübner. Both were convinced that the 2D Division should withdraw. As Hübner departed, he told Robertson, "Go slow and watch your step. The overall situation is not good." No division commander as experienced as Robertson was could have been unaware of the precarious position of his command. All 3 battalions of the 9th Infantry and 2 of the 38th were fighting at Valor, those of the 9th Infantry seriously depleted by the heavy fighting for the road junction, and the remaining battalion of the 38th Infantry was well forward in reserve. A battalion of the 23D Infantry was also forward, as were 2 battalions of the 2D Division's artillery, even more dependent than the infantry, should it come to withdrawal, on the single road leading back through the dense forest to Krinkelt-Rocherath. The 99th Division's 395th Infantry also depended upon that road for survival. Hardly had Hübner left Robertson's command post than Robertson, without notifying General Gero, telephoned the commanders of his 2 attacking regiments and told them to halt their attacks and hold where they were. Although he added an order to renew the attacks the next morning, he left the hour open, and the attacks were to be launched only on his specific command. That done, Robertson went forward up the critical road to ensure that both regimental commanders fully understood what they were to do, and that they alerted their battalions to begin planning for withdrawal. Then, back in his headquarters in a farmhouse on the edge of Würzfeld, he and his chief of staff, Karl Ralph W. Zwicker, sat up well past midnight refining the withdrawal plan. At the 99th Division's headquarters a few miles away in Butgenbach, General Lauer exhibited far less concern. Lauer was exceedingly proud of the way his inexperienced troops had fought that day, and nowhere had there been a penetration in depth. At midnight, he reported personally by telephone to General Gero that he had heard from all his units, and his entire front was practically established on its original line that the situation was in hand and all quiet. Yet his south flank, he added, did have him considerably worried. Lauer's report was far more optimistic than the actual situation justified, and was particularly strange in that Lauer knew that men of the 394th Infantry's Company A had captured a copy of Field Marshal von Rundstedt's order, telling his troops that their great hour had arrived. "We gamble everything." Lauer hardly could have continued to believe that his division was encountering a mere local reaction to the attack for the Roer River dams. Admittedly, Lauer did have the added strength of the battalion of the 23D Infantry in the woods east of Krinkelt-Rocherath, and of the other battalion moving into prepared positions at Hunningen. The battalion at Hunningen would help strengthen the division's southern flank, about which Lauer was so concerned. Although he knew nothing of the fate of the 394th Infantry's Wust and R platoon outside Lanzerath, he knew he still had some troops near Buchholz station, and not far away at Hunfeld, the commander of the 394th Infantry's rest centre, was forming a provisional company from men who had been at the centre to defend the village. Thus there was at least a shield, albeit thin, covering the division's southern flank. On the German side of the international highway, the commanders were markedly disappointed with the results of the first day's fight. Most had expected that as early as 7 a.m., and surely well before nightfall, columns of the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions would have been well past the forward American positions on their way to the Meuse. Yet nowhere had there been a penetration sufficient for the panzers to exploit. One man who was particularly concerned was Otto Skorzeny, whose special brigade was to follow the panzer divisions. Trying to go forward to Losheim to find out what was happening, he encountered roads so jammed with vehicles and horse-drawn artillery that he had to walk almost 6 miles to get there. Since it was obvious the day's objectives were out of reach, and since the success of Operation Grafe depended upon surprise and speed, he was tempted to call off the operation. Yet if the panzer divisions got through that night or early the next morning, he decided finally there still might be a chance of reaching the Meuse, in which case his men seizing the bridges could be decisive. For his part, the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, General Priess, was fuming. Having already ordered a battalion of SS Panzer Grenadiers to try to achieve a breakthrough in the direction of Krinkelt-Rocherath, he told the commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Brigade Führer der Waffen SS Hugo Krass, to commit 2 more battalions of SS Panzer Grenadiers, supported by 2 companies of Mark IV tanks and 2 companies of Panthers. When Krass protested the attachment of his tanks to the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, Priess relented and put Krass himself in charge. From that point, the assignment of breaking through the forest to Krinkelt-Rocherath fell to the 12th SS Panzer Division, with such help as the badly depleted 277th Volksgrenadiers might provide. In front of Losheimer Graben, the commander of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, General Major Gerhard Engel, exhorted the commander of his tank destroyer battalion, Major Holtz, to bring his assault guns into play at the crossroads. At the same time, an even more determined commander, Joachim Peiper, arrived on the scene a few miles to the south at Lanzerath. Shortly before midnight, Peiper pushed his way into the Café Scholzen. On the dingy floor, wounded Germans and Americans were sprawled against the walls. Under a cuckoo clock mounted on one wall slumped an American lieutenant holding a soldier who had lost part of his face and was bleeding profusely over the lieutenant's uniform. Other Germans seemed simply to have chosen the tavern as a place to sleep. What was the matter? Had everybody simply gone to bed instead of waging war? Peiper was already in a foul mood. All day he had waited, his tanks and half-tracks using up precious gasoline in traffic jams, and still no penetration to spring his column loose. In the end, he had simply ploughed his way forward, ordering his tank commanders, if they had to run down the horse-drawn artillery that was clogging the roads. Then to arrive at the Café Scholzen and find that everybody appeared to have called off the war for the night. Locating the commander of the 9th Parachute Regiment, Karl Helmut von Hoffmann, Peiper learned that he was delaying his attack until morning because the woods between Lanzerath and Hunfeld were heavily fortified, defended by at least a battalion, and the road was mined. Had he personally reconnoitred the American positions? Demanded Peiper, uncaring that as a lieutenant colonel he was grilling a senior officer. Well, no, replied von Hoffmann, but in disgust Peiper demanded that the colonel reinforce him with one of his parachute infantry battalions. He was going through. At 51 years of age, Omar Nelson Bradley still had a touch of rural Missouri about him. He spoke with a high-pitched voice in a Fiat Midwestern accent. His hair was thinning and his ears protruded. To many, he had the air of a schoolteacher, as well he might, for his father had been one in Missouri, and he himself had spent 13 of his first 23 years of commissioned service teaching, either in the ROTC at West Point or at the infantry school. It was at the infantry school at Fort Benning that Bradley had first come into contact with a man who was destined to become the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff and to make an indelible imprint on the conduct of the war, George Catlett Marshall. Bradley's class of 1915 at West Point would be known as the class the stars fell. On 59 of them became general officers, and a number who received their stars, including Dwight D. Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, could attribute their accession in large measure to the fact that George Marshall recognized their talents. On the morning of December 16th, Omar Bradley awoke in his room in the Hotel Alpha, looking out over the Place de Metz in Luxembourg City to confront a dismal day, cold, damp, foggy. It came as little surprise when at breakfast in the hotel's plain ground-floor restaurant, his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Chester B. Hanson, told him that it would be impossible to fly to a scheduled appointment with General Eisenhower at SHAEF's main headquarters in Versailles. Yet Bradley considered the business to be discussed so significant that he determined to proceed by car. Indeed, in order to stress its importance, he planned to accompany his personnel officer, Brig. General Joseph J. O'Hare, on the first leg of a trip to Washington, where O'Hare was to press the War Department for more infantry replacements for the European theatre. To get an early start on the 4-hour drive, Bradley decided to forego the usual 9:15 situation briefing at his headquarters, but as it turned out, he missed nothing of significance. As his olive-drab Cadillac sedan threaded through the fog-enshrouded streets of Luxembourg City and out onto an icy highway leading to Verdun and Paris, a briefing officer from the operations section was noting that there had been little change along any part of the front. That included the sectors of the First Army's 5 and 8 Corps. When a briefing officer from the intelligence section had his say, he noted that the 326th Volksgrenadier Division had been identified moving north through the Eifel, which he added might be the answer to the numerous vehicular movements in the northern 8 Corps sector. Nobody yet knew anything of the portentous events already taking place in the Ardennes searchlights, heavy artillery fire, ground attacks which at one point were occurring little more than 20 miles away. After a stop for lunch in a transient officers' mess at the Ritz in Paris, Bradley and his party went on to Versailles, reaching Eisenhower's headquarters in the Trianon Palace Hotel early in the afternoon. They found the Supreme Commander in a pleasant mood. He had learned earlier in the day of his promotion to the rank of General of the Army, which carried with it 5 stars, the equivalent of Field Marshal in other armies. He had also just had an enjoyable diversion, the wedding of his orderly Mickey McHugh to a soldier from the headquarters, Pearlie Hargreaves. It was late afternoon, almost dusk, when a colonel from SHAEF's G2 section tiptoed into the room where Eisenhower, Bradley, O'Hare, and several members of Eisenhower's staff were talking. He handed a note to Eisenhower's G2, General Strong. Glancing at it, Strong interrupted the conference to say that the Germans had attacked at 5 points along the front of the 8 Corps. Although the attacks had begun early in the morning, there was as yet no word as to their size or extent. As Strong moved over toward a situation map to indicate the points of enemy attack, Bradley found it impossible to believe that the enemy could be launching more than a spoiling attack, with perhaps 4 to 6 divisions, designed to upset the First Army's attack for the Roer River dams and the Third Army's impending attack against the Saar industrial region south of the Ardennes. After all, only a few days earlier, Bradley's G2, General Sibert, had remarked on the critical dilemma faced by the German command, and even General Strong, who had warned of possible enemy action in the Ardennes, had spoken only of a relieving attack. A short while later, a message arrived indicating that 8 German divisions not previously identified on the Ardennes front were involved in the attacks. Recalling how Bradley on a number of occasions had wished for the Germans to come out of their pillboxes and fight in the open, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, put a hand on Bradley's shoulder. "Well, Brad," he said, "you have been wishing for a counterattack. Now it looks as though you have got it." "A counterattack, yes," replied Bradley, "but I will be damned if I wanted one this big." Yet Bradley was still unconvinced that the Germans were launching anything more than a spoiling attack. "No," said Eisenhower, "it was no spoiling attack." Eisenhower, apparently through the magic intercepts of Baron Oshimus messages, knew something Bradley did not know, calling for a situation map that showed 2 American armored divisions out of the line, the 7th Armored Division with the 9th Army in the north, and the 10th Armored Division with the 3rd Army in the south. Eisenhower said he thought Bradley should send Middleton some help. These 2 armored divisions. Still, Bradley cavilled, while agreeing that it would be prudent to shift the 2 divisions to remove a division from the 3rd Army just as General Patton was preparing to launch a big offensive, was bound to upset Patton. "Tell him," Eisenhower came back, "that Ike is running this damn war." When Bradley got Patton on the telephone, Patton was indeed irate. It was nothing more than a spoiling attack, Patton insisted, and Troy Middleton could handle that himself. "I hate like hell to do it, George," Bradley responded, "but I have got to have that division. Even if it is only a spoiling attack, as you say, Middleton must have help." That done, Bradley telephoned his staff in Luxembourg City with instructions to tell General Simpson of the 9th Army to put the 7th Armored Division on the road. He also directed both Patton and Simpson to alert any other divisions that were out of the line for a possible move to the Ardennes. Bradley and Eisenhower had dinner that night in Eisenhower's imposing requisitioned stone villa in nearby Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a villa earlier occupied by Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Afterwards, they cracked a bottle of champagne to celebrate Eisenhower's promotion and played 5 rubbers of bridge. Shortly before 11, as the two were at the point of retiring, they learned of a message just received in Schaeff's Ultra Room in an attic above the palace stables. Bletchley Park had intercepted and decrypted a signal ordering the German Air Command in the Netherlands, Jagerkorps II, to be prepared the next morning, the 17th, to support the attack of 5 and 6 armies. Eisenhower and Bradley could hardly have been unaware that that meant the 5th and 6th Panzer armies. After Bradley finally got to bed around midnight, he found it difficult to fall asleep, and when he did, he slept fitfully. In an age of virtually instantaneous communications by telephone, telegraph, and radio, it was taking a surprisingly long time for information about the German offensive to reach Eisenhower's headquarters. Except for the late-night flash from Bletchley Park, there was even more than 18 hours after the start of the German artillery preparation, little to go on. The artillery preparation itself was in large measure responsible. Almost everywhere the shelling knocked out telephone lines leading from frontline units, and even in experienced regiments, rear headquarters were often slow in the wee hours to realize that lines were out and switch on their radios. Add to that the time it took an officer to pass a message to a corporal or a sergeant for transmission to the message center, then the time it took the message to move up the chain of command, from battalion to regiment to division to corps to army group to Schaeff. So too, as with intelligence reports, there was a process of selection, what was important enough to pass up the line. Although there was no problem with telephone lines at corps level and above, the 2 corps headquarters were slow to get solid information to pass along. And for some reason, neither Eisenhower nor Bradley deigned to pick up the telephone and talk directly with the senior commander most intimately concerned, Courtney Hodges of the First Army. In early afternoon, the text of von Rundstedt's hortatory field order to the German troops, captured by the 99th Division's 394th Infantry, reached headquarters of the First Army, whence it passed quickly to headquarters of the 12th Army Group. It stopped there. Not until early the next morning were Eisenhower and Bradley in Versailles to learn of it, and then it was by means of an ultra-intercept sent from Bletchley Park. Rundstedt on 16th informed soldiers of West Front that hour of destiny had struck. Mighty offensive armies faced allies, everything at stake, more than mortal deeds for fatherland and Führer. A, quote, holy duty, unquote. No American commander on the Western Front had more concern for the men serving under him than did Courtney Hicks Hodges, commander of the First Army. He personally saw to it that towns behind the line were set aside as rest centers for the exclusive use of combat troops where, by his direction, the men were to eat, drink, loaf, and do whatever they wish within the limits of propriety. On at least one occasion he told his jeep driver to halt while he got out to stand by the road as trucks sloshed past carrying bearded, grimy, bone-tired infantrymen of the 4th Division from the fighting in the Hurtgen forest. As he watched, tears came to his eyes. I wish, he said, everybody could see them. Hodges' concern may have stemmed from the fact that only he among all the senior US commanders in Europe had seen war at the level where men do the dying. In charge of a machine gun company in the grim Meuse-Argonne campaign of World War I, he had received the nation's second highest award for valor, the Distinguished Service Cross. So too, only he among the senior commanders had served as an enlisted man. Having failed geometry in his plebe year at West Point, Hodges had joined the army as a private but had earned a commission only a year behind his former classmates at the military academy. With grey hair and moustache, he was 6 years older than Bradley. Hodges looked more businessman than soldier. Georgia-born, he was soft-spoken. He was also taciturn. Lacking personal eccentricities, he seemed essentially colourless, but both Bradley and Eisenhower thought highly of him. His only fault, it seemed to Eisenhower, was that God gave him a face that always looked pessimistic. Bradley had implicit faith in his judgment, skill, and restraint. Hodges and Bradley had served together at the Army War College and on the faculty of the Infantry School, where Hodges too impressed George Marshall, and where Bradley later succeeded Hodges as commandant. When Bradley commanded the First Army in the invasion of Normandy, Hodges was his deputy, serving with the sure knowledge that after Bradley moved up to command an army group, Hodges was to get the First Army. Inheriting Bradley's staff with the exception of the G1, Red O'Hare, whom Bradley took with him, Hodges made no changes, for he himself had helped select most of the officers. Shortly before 7 a.m. on December 16th, as Hodges, still bothered by a head cold, was preparing to sit down to breakfast in his requisitioned villa outside Spa, he received first word of enemy action in the Ardennes, German attacks against the cavalry in the Losheim Gap, and the heaviest artillery fire ever received in the 28th Division area. Hodges went quickly to his office in the Hotel Britannique, where news of other attacks all along the line as far south as Echternach soon came in, some in large patrol strength and others in battalion strength. On the basis of the early reports, Hodges perceived the greatest threat to be against the 106th Division and in the Losheim Gap. Just before 10:30, he directed General Gero of the Phi Corps to release Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division from attachment to the 2D Division and turn it over to Troy Middleton of the 8th Corps to be used to help the 106th Division. At noon, Hodges ordered the commander of the 7th Corps in the vicinity of Aachen, Major General J. Lawton Collins, to place a regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, which had recently come out of the line after fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, on 6-hour alert for possible movement to the Ardennes. An hour later, he told Collins to put the entire 1st Division on 6-hour alert, along with a combat command of the 3D Armoured Division. Even so, when G. Gero telephoned to ask authority to call off the 2D Division's attack for the Roer River dams, Hodges said no. If the Germans were trying to divert that attack, why give them what they were after? The news in early afternoon of the capture of von Rundstedt's order would seem to have made it clear that more than a spoiling attack was underway, even more so because the order bore an endorsement from the commander of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, General Engel. This call to arms to be made known to all soldiers without exception at once before beginning of attack. Yet that fact occasioned no particular alarm. Hodges' junior liaison officers, whom he always maintained at the divisions to keep his headquarters informed, were reporting that even though some companies and battalions had given ground and some were isolated, there had been no major German penetration, and nobody saw the situation as critical. As late as 4:15 p.m., the 28th Division, which all along its extended front was under heavy attack, reported that the situation for the division is well in hand. Furthermore, in late afternoon, Hodges received word from the 12th Army Group that he was to get the 7th and 10th Armoured Divisions. Hodges was neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but on the evidence he had received to that point, he believed not only that he could handle the attack, but that it afforded an opportunity to inflict heavy losses on the enemy. Nevertheless, before retiring for the evening, he ordered the 1st Division to send one of its regiments immediately to help the 99th Division, and by midnight the 26th Infantry was on the way. He had still to retire when a German plane strafed the road in front of his villa and dropped 2 bombs nearby. Shortly after Hodges finally went to bed that night of December 16th, word came through a radio intercept from the Heidsietzing Tactical Air Command, which supported the 9th Army, that planes were preparing to take off from airfields east of the Rhine near Paderborn to drop parachutists behind the 1st Army's lines. Somebody on Hodges' staff alerted the guard at the gatehouse in front of the villa to watch for parachutists and doubled the guard. At 2 other headquarters buildings within Belgium, there was no such ambiguity. The 5th Corps was based in the Belgian Army's Physical Training Institute on Belmarinstrasse, Eupen. The 8th Corps had its headquarters in a red-tiled caserne in Bastogne that belonged to the Belgian Army. At both headquarters, the capture of von Rundstedt's order removed any doubt about what the Germans were up to. For the 8th Corps, there was an additional indication with the 106th Division's capture of the order providing details of Skorzenis Operation Greif, and on the body of a fallen officer of the 116th Panzer Division, someone found not only a copy of von Rundstedt's order, but similar orders issued by Field Marshal Model and General von Manteuffel. Model: "We will not disappoint the Führer and the fatherland, who created the sword of retribution. Forward in the spirit of Leuthen. Von Manteuffel, forward march, march, in remembrance of our dead comrades and therefore on their order, and in remembrance of the tradition of our proud Wehrmacht." In passing along those orders and von Rundstedt's, the 8th Corps G2, Colonel Reeves noted, "These documents indicate the scope of the German offensive, and its importance becomes apparent from the impressive list of high-ranking German generals whose signatures appear thereon. The grief operation appears to be a part of a large-scale offensive. Gero and Middleton also discounted the optimistic reports from some of their units, such as that from the 28th Division that all was well in hand. Middleton was all the while getting full and candid reports from the inexperienced Jones of the 106th Division, who had yet to learn the old dodge that one's own command looks better if the enemy's successes appear to be less, and it was clearly obvious that something serious was happening in the Losheim Gap. Gero, too, received cheerful reports, the 99th Division telephoning that by 11:30 hours we had practically restored our line to its former positions, but that failed to deter him from asking Hodges permission to call off the 2D Division's attack and pull the division back to the Elsenborn Ridge. At the headquarters of the 12th Army Group across from the railroad station in Luxembourg City, there was no such view of what the Germans were trying to accomplish. The sudden attacks and seemingly overpowering array of 6 enemy divisions should not be misinterpreted, wrote General Seibert. The quality of divisions involved, the piecemeal efforts to launch small-scale attacks, and the apparent lack of long-range objectives would seem to limit the enemy threat. Seibert in fact saw the enemy's attack much as did his boss, General Bradley, back in Versailles, as a diversionary attack to disrupt the American attacks north and south of the Ardennes, until the magnitude of the enemy's attack increases in more cohesive action, or until one or more elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army are committed, Seibert concluded. The day's events cannot be regarded as a major long-term threat. The key phrase was piecemeal efforts, that looked to Seibert to be the case partly because of erratic reports from the front and partly because the inexperienced German troops were generally slow to follow up their artillery fire, so that there was no impression of one grand assault. Yet those attacks still occurred over an extended front, all the way from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. Should not that fact in itself have conveyed some meaning? Whether the ex-journalist Ralph Ingersoll massaged that report or not, what it had to say was clear. The intelligence section at headquarters of the 12th Army Group was as yet unprepared to go back on its earlier miscalculation of what the enemy was capable of doing. General Seibert nevertheless put somebody to work trying to contact the 1st Army's G2, Monk Dixon, on leave in Paris. The word finally got through to Dixon. Seibert suggested that he make his way as quickly as possible to Luxembourg City. Among the German army commanders, there was disappointment that in the first day of the grand offensive they had gained considerably less than they had intended. Yet there was no despair. He who had expected the least, General Brandenberger, was the most optimistic. He considered that his 7th Army was close to a breakthrough. For General von Manteuffel, the 5th Panzer Army's gains did not come up to expectations, but he hoped to make up for lost time by continuing to attack through the night. There was more concern in the 6th Panzer Army, if not with the commander, General Dietrich, then with his more pragmatic Chief of Staff, General Kramer. He thought the unexpectedly strong resistance from Monschau to Losheimergraben was predicated upon his enemy's expectation of rapid reinforcement from the north, and because the 326th Volksgrenadier Division had failed to break through at Monschau and von der Heydte's parachutists had failed to jump, there was nothing to keep those reinforcements from arriving. In late afternoon, Kramer himself telephoned von der Heydte, telling him it was vital for his parachutists to jump that night and block the highway leading south across the Haute-Farn. Hold on as long as possible, Kramer told him, 2 days as a minimum, and do as much damage as you can to the reinforcements. From the first, Friedrich von der Heydte had been concerned about the inexperience of his young parachutists, and when he learned the background of the Luftwaffe crews that were to fly him to the drop zone, he was appalled. Although the crews belonged to the renowned Stalingrad Squadron, which had flown supplies to Field Marshal Paulus' besieged troops at Stalingrad, the only man remaining who had actually flown those missions was the squadron commander. None of the others had ever dropped parachutists in a combat operation, none had ever flown a combat mission of any kind, and none had ever flown his Junkers 52 aircraft at night. Von der Heydte could see nothing ahead but disaster. When most of the parachutists failed to reach the airfields on the night of December 15th, von der Heydte hoped with some degree of fervour that the operation might be cancelled. Headquarters of the 6th Panzer Army quickly sent an investigating officer to conduct a formal inquiry into von der Heydte's failure to take off, and von der Heydte was clearly under suspicion of sabotaging the operation. Was he not a cousin of the officer who had planted the bomb back in July in the plot to kill the Führer? Yet General Kramer's order to jump on the night of the 16th ended both the investigation and von der Heiter's fervent hopes of a cancellation. Just before midnight, 112 Junkers 52S began to taxi to take off positions on two airfields near Paderborn. By tradition, von der Heiter, as commander, was in the leading Pathfinder plane and would jump first. He would be jumping with his right arm in a splint, hurt a few weeks before in an airplane accident in Italy. As the planes took off and searchlights lit up one by one to guide them to and over the Rhine, von der Heiter began to have some hope that the inexperienced pilots and navigators might yet deliver his troops to the correct drop zone. In time, he could make out the trace of the front, distinguishable by the flash of artillery pieces and the light of smouldering buildings. As the planes flew over, there was no mistaking it, for to help maintain formation, the pilots were flying with their navigation lights on, and heavy anti-aircraft fire erupted. When they were over the drop zone, the Pathfinder planes dropped incendiary bombs to mark it, and von der Heiter, his right arm strapped to his side, dove into the night. As he neared the ground, a strong wind seized his parachute, and when he landed, the impact knocked him unconscious. When at last he came to his senses, he found himself alone. Taking a compass bearing, he began to walk toward the designated rendezvous, a road junction known as Belle Croix astride the north-south highway leading across the moors. There he found 20 of his men, 20 out of 1,200. Others were to turn up in time, but for the most part the planes had scattered the parachutists all the way from the Rhine to the Haute Fagne, and some far to the north in the sector of the 9th U.S. Army beyond Aachen. In the Adlerhorst, amid the forested hills of the Taunus, Field Marshal von Rundstedt made no effort to spare his Führer his own pessimistic evaluation of the first day's events. There was no question, he said, that the offensive had achieved total surprise, yet the main effort by the 6th Panzer Army had failed to achieve a penetration. That meant a loss of at least a day, making it questionable whether the army could reach the Meuse. The report infuriated Hitler. The weight of the 6th Panzer Army's SS Panzer divisions had yet to be felt, he said. Once they got going, they would crush everything before them. When the briefing was over, well after midnight, late nights were commonplace with the Führer. Hitler got on the telephone to the commander of Army Group G, General der Panzertruppen Hermann Balck, who was responsible for the front south of the Ardennes. Balck thought at first he was in for yet another diatribe admonishing him to hold fast, yield not a foot of ground, but he soon found that the Führer had something different to say. Good old dependable Dietrich, said Hitler, had punched a hole in the Losheim Gap, and Kampfgruppe Piper was poised for the march to the Meuse. Von Manteuffel was encircling the Schnee Eifel, already had tanks on the heights overlooking Clairvaux, and would be on the way to Bastogne and the Meuse as soon as it was daylight. And the weather. The forecast was for more of the same fog, drizzle, perhaps some light snow, but in any case weather to keep Allied planes on the ground. Despite himself, Balck, a hardened old soldier, became caught up in his Führer's enthusiasm. Balck, Balck, Hitler exulted. Everything has changed in the West. Success, complete success, is now in our grasp. The reality of what actually happened on that first day lay somewhere in between Hitler's elation and the incomprehension of Omar Bradley and Edwin Seibert of the 12th Army Group. Bradley and Seibert were finding it difficult to accept that the German blow in the Ardennes was a major offensive. No goddamn fool would do it, and Hitler was reading more into his army's successes than was actually there. In the far south, all 4 divisions of Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army had crossed the Our and Shore rivers, which in view of the thin American positions was hardly to have been prevented, but unknown to Brandenberger, he was soon to be facing American reserves. At Marnac, von Manteuffel's tanks were indeed on the heights overlooking Clairvaux, but everywhere else the 28th Division's 110th Infantry was still making a fight of it, and how soon von Manteuffel's 2 Panzer Corps could get across the Clairve River and on with the drive for Bastogne and the Meuse remained to be seen. So, too, the 28th Division's 112th Infantry was still holding firm. From the American viewpoint, the most critical sector as night fell on December 16th was the Losheim Gap and the threatened encirclement of 2 regiments of the 106th Division on the Schnee Eifel. Yet there, too, it remained to be seen how long it would take von Manteuffel's Volksgrenadier divisions to gain St.vith and open the road net in the vicinity, a road net critical for sustaining a broad-based advance to the Meuse. Since the cavalry at Monschau and the 99th Division at Hofen and along the International Highway had stopped the 6th Panzer Army's Volksgrenadier divisions. The critical sector for the Germans, too, was the Losheim Gap, for in northern reaches of the gap, Joachim Peiper, as Hitler said, was genuinely poised for the march to the Meuse, despite the fight put up by the men of the 99th Division, which, as von Rundstedt noted, had produced a delay of at least a day in the quest for the Meuse. Chances for a breakthrough along the international highway were good, particularly east of Krinkelt Rocherath, where the 12th SS Panzer Division was getting ready to take over the assignment. If the added weight of tanks could produce a quick breakthrough there, the Germans would score a success they had no inkling of, for they would trap the 2D Division. The 12th SS Panzer Division would also be past the first big hurdle in a drive for the Meuse close along the flank of Kampfgruppe Peiper and the 1st SS Panzer Division. Nevertheless, except in gaining total surprise, nowhere on December 16th had the Germans achieved any of their first day's goals. The soldiers whom Hitler saw as the Italians of the Allied side, how could a nation as heterogeneous as the United States of America, with its mixture of ethnic and racial types, field a capable fighting force, had nowhere turned and run? When men in foxholes refuse to admit overwhelming odds, advance through or past them may be inevitable, but it is seldom either easy or swift. Handsome, well-bred, dashing and resourceful, Joachim Peiper, at a youthful 29, brought to the Ardennes long months of combat experience in Russia, where he had risen from command of one of the 1st SS Panzer Division's Panzer Grenadier battalions to command of the division's Panzer Regiment. He had been awarded Nazi Germany's highest award for valor, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, and had earned the admiration of his troops for bravery, sang-froid, and ruthlessness. He personally led a night attack on the village of Pekotchina with flamethrowers mounted on his half-tracks and burned the village to the ground. Other units of the division called Peiper's SS Panzer Grenadiers, the Blowtorch Battalion. In one drive, the Panzer Regiment under Peiper's command claimed 2,500 Russians killed and only 3 captured, which was testimony to the brutality, fanaticism, and mounting desperation that characterized the ideological racist war in the East, at least as Peiper practiced it. Many of the men who came with Peiper to the Ardennes had also experienced that savagery. Peiper received his orders for what his superiors called the decisive role in the offensive 3 days before the start of the attack from the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, General Priess. In the course of the briefing, Priess passed along an order of the day from the 6th Panzer Army's commander, General Dietrich, which reflected Hitler's exhortation to his senior commanders at the Adlerhorst. The offensive represented the decisive hour of the German people, and thus was to be conducted with a wave of terror and fright and without humane inhibitions. As Peiper himself later recalled the order, the German soldiers were to be reminded of the innumerable German victims of the bombing terror. He was also nearly certain that it was expressly stated that prisoners of war must be shot where the local conditions of combat should so require it. Although that proviso was incorporated into the Kampfgruppe's order for the attack, Peiper himself made no mention of it in his oral briefing to his commanders, for they were all experienced officers to whom this was obvious. The word to kill prisoners nevertheless reached almost all subordinate units. One company commander enjoined his men to fight in the old SS spirit and added, "I am not giving you orders to shoot prisoners of war, but you are all well-trained SS soldiers. You know what you should do with prisoners without me telling you that." A private recalled that not only were they to take no prisoners, but civilians who show themselves on the streets or at the windows will be shot without mercy. One non-commissioned officer urged his men to think of the thousands of German women and children buried in the rubble of German cities. Then they would know what you as SS men have to do in case you capture American soldiers. The offensive was aimed at the murderers of our mothers, fathers, and children. Serious questions were to arise later as to the methods through which those testimonials, including Peiper's, were elicited. On the other hand, it would be hard to maintain that all that was about to happen in abject violation of the basic rules of international warfare was the result of nothing more than spontaneous reaction to the pressures of the battlefield. Kampfgruppe Peiper was a powerful force of approximately 4,000 men. Peiper had 72 medium tanks almost equally divided between Mark IVs and Mark Vs, roughly the equivalent of 1.5 American tank battalions. He also had 5 flak tanks, a light flak battalion with self-propelled multiple 20 mm guns, about 25 assault guns and self-propelled tank destroyers, an artillery battalion with towed 105 howitzers, a battalion of SS Panzer Grenadiers, around 80 half-tracks, a few reconnaissance troops and 2 companies of engineers, although the column was supposed to move so rapidly that the engineers carried no bridge construction equipment. Attached to Piper were one of Skorzeny's 4-man teams disguised as Americans, one of Skorzeny's task forces with 700 men and 12 Panthers disguised to look like Shermans, and 30 68-ton Mark VI tanks of the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. Because the Tigers were slow and cumbersome, Piper put them at the rear of his column to be called forward once the advance reached more open country close to the Meuse. The rest of the 1st SS Panzer Division was to proceed in 3 columns, composed of the division's reconnaissance battalion. One was to follow Piper in order to deal with any threat to resupply. 2 others were to proceed through the lower portion of the Losheim Gap, one composed of the 2 DSS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, reinforced by the division's 20 remaining tanks and most of its 22 self-propelled tank destroyers, the other composed of the 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment with a few of the tank destroyers. The division commander, Karl Wilhelm Monke, his headquarters and support troops, and the bulk of the division's artillery were to bring up the rear. Should Piper's column be held up, one of the other columns was to assume the mission of seizing the bridges over the Meuse. As Piper calculated it, his column would be about 15 miles long, and in the sharply compartmented terrain of the Ardennes, mostly roadbound. If he was to accomplish his mission of driving swiftly to the Meuse without regard for his flanks, he needed the heavy firepower of the Mark IVs and Panthers to the fore, intermixed with SS Panzer Grenadiers riding in half-tracks, who would be called upon as required to help the tanks. Piper established his command group midway in the column, but he himself would usually be well forward in one of the leading half-tracks. In Lanzerath in the early hours of December 17th, it took the commander of the parachute battalion that Piper had commandeered considerable time to roust his men from the houses where they had settled down for the night. Thus it was close to 4 in the morning before the leading vehicles of Kampfgruppe Piper 2 Panthers and 3 half-tracks began the advance on the first objective of Hunfeld. 4 Mark IV flak tanks, each equipped with a 37 cannon and 2 flak wagons with quadruple 20 pieces, were next in line, followed by more half-tracks transporting SS Panzer Grenadiers and tanks with paratroopers clinging to the decks. A company of paratroopers advanced on foot to provide flank protection as the column moved through woods between Buchholz Farm and Hunfeld. Where were the mines and well-manned American defenses that Colonel von Hoffmann had predicted? Piper's leading vehicles encountered nothing, and only those vehicles well back in the column came under any fire from the 2 platoons of Company K, 394th Infantry, at the farm and in the nearby woods. The platoons quickly disintegrated under fire from the quad 20s on the flak wagons. 1 American remained, a radio operator hiding in the cellar of the farmhouse. He counted the German vehicles as they passed and reported the number by radio to his regimental headquarters. He got up to 28 half-tracks and 30 tanks before the Germans routed him out. Just over a mile short of Hunfeld, a road from within the Losheim Gap joined the Lanzerath-Hunfeld road. As Piper's lead tank reached the road junction, the driver came upon American vehicles heading into Hunfeld. He fell in behind one of them and followed. In Hunfeld, the captain commanding the 394th Infantry's rest center had had a busy day. He first had to welcome Marlene Dietrich, who was supposed to entertain the troops, then hurriedly send her back. As the situation everywhere along the front worsened, he used the men from the rest center, augmented by stragglers, to form a provisional company and placed them in positions behind a creek a few hundred yards to the east and south of the town. 2 platoons of towed guns of the 801st Tank Destroyer Battalion backed up that line from the edge of the village. When 2 platoons of towed guns of the 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion arrived around 3 o'clock in the morning, borrowed from the 2D Division, the commander of the 801st Guns told the leaders of those 2 platoons to bed down for the rest of the night. He would direct them into firing positions at daylight. Earlier, when Lieutenant Repper and his troop of cavalry arrived from the Losheim Gap, Repper checked in with the captain from the 99th Division, who asked him to be prepared to send out patrols the next morning, but suggested his men bed down for the night in the village. Repper did as he was told, but he sent an armoured car commanded by Sergeant George Creel to take up a position just beyond the last house in Hunfeld, along the road entering the village from the south, the direction of Lanzerath, and give the alarm should the Germans approach.